Health experts will tell you that Brazil nuts are the single best source of selenium available, and that you should be eating at least one every single day. But that's not entirely true. Yes, it's true that Brazil nuts contain more selenium than any other food, but they also have a dirty little secret. 3 dirty little secrets, in fact. And these downsides to Brazil nuts may be enough to make you think twice before taking the advice of eating one Brazil nut every day. Before you start munching on Brazil nuts, here are 3 things that you should know. Number 1, the selenium content of Brazil nuts varies significantly from nut to nut. The advice to eat a Brazil nut every day is primarily based on the selenium content. And with the fact that up to 1 billion people are selenium deficient, and the benefits that taking selenium can have on your overall health, this appears at first glance to make perfect sense. After all, selenium is necessary for thyroid health, immune function, glutathione production, and for acting as a powerful antioxidant. Some people are even using it for its anti-cancer benefits. But there's one big problem with this idea. You simply can't count on Brazil nuts as a consistent dietary source of selenium. And we have research to prove this. One study showed that the selenium content of Brazil nuts from different areas can vary as much as 11% of the RDA all the way up to 288% of the RDA. The same study also found that the selenium content in soil varies as much as 65 micrograms per day all the way up to 625 micrograms per day. Put into context, this means that Brazil nuts from different locations within the same country can have as little as 6 micrograms of selenium per nut all the way up to 154 micrograms per nut. Talk about variability. This is primarily because Brazil nut trees are hyperaccumulators of selenium, and because of the selenium content of the soil where they're found, both of which impact the final selenium content of the nut that the tree provides. By itself, this isn't necessarily a reason to want to avoid Brazil nuts altogether, but it should be taken into account. The standard selenium content cited by most health professionals is a range of 68 micrograms up to 91 micrograms per each Brazil nut. But the reality is that this number can vary as much as 6 micrograms per nut all the way up to 154 micrograms per nut. In other words, if you were to follow this strategy, you would be getting either way more selenium than you thought or way less. Normally, this wouldn't be a big issue. After all, the body is actually pretty good at eliminating extra nutrients that it doesn't need. But selenium is an exception. You absolutely don't want to take too much of it. And this brings us to point number 2, which is it's actually a lot easier than you think to accidentally take too much. Let's think about this for a second. The RDA for selenium is set at 55 micrograms per day. Now, I'm not a huge fan of the RDA in general, but there are situations in which the RDA is pretty accurate, and this is one where it gets close. By the way, I'll talk about my own personal recommendation for selenium intake later on in this video, so stay tuned for that. Now that we have the RDA in mind, let's look at the selenium content for a standard serving of Brazil nuts. Even though it varies, we can estimate that a serving size of 1 ounce of Brazil nuts, which is around 6 to 8 nuts by the way, contains on average 544 micrograms, which is roughly 10 times the RDA. And as I said before, if this were something like vitamin B12, this wouldn't even be an issue because your body would simply take what it needs and pee the rest out. But that's not the case with selenium. You can actually start to develop selenium toxicity if your dose exceeds a certain threshold. And 544 micrograms is bordering right on that level. In fact, consistent daily doses of higher than 400 micrograms per day of selenium may push you over that edge, but certainly doses higher than 600 micrograms per day will definitely put you over that edge. And remember, it only took 6 to 8 Brazil nuts to get to this level. You can easily see a scenario in which someone who starts snacking on Brazil nuts may inadvertently get way too much selenium without even realizing it. And this is a big problem because the symptoms of selenium toxicity mirror those of selenium deficiency and may include things like hair loss, nail damage, fatigue, joint pain, and nausea. The worst thing you could possibly do is consume Brazil nuts thinking you're treating a selenium deficiency, all the while causing selenium toxicity and making your symptoms worse. And yet this is definitely happening to some people. But that's not the only issue with taking too much selenium, which brings us to point number 3. There may be a connection between excess selenium intake and your risk of diabetes. Now, this topic is controversial and still evolving, but it's worth spending a little bit of time on. Research over the last decade has suggested that selenium intake above the RDA does track with diabetes risk. Correlation does not equal causation here, but at the very least, it suggests that it's not a good idea to take more selenium than you need. And if there is a connection between selenium intake and your risk of diabetes, it's not something you would see with just a few random high doses here and there. It's something that would build up in your body day by day after taking higher doses than selenium for a long period of time. Taking something like 200 micrograms of selenium every day for 3 to 4 years might get you there. It's unlikely that you'd reach this threshold with just eating Brazil nuts alone, but it's certainly possible if you were to combine your intake of selenium from food along with your intake of selenium from supplements. Both of these factors together could easily get you to that 200 microgram range per day. What does all this mean for you? I'm all for getting as many nutrients from food as possible, but we also have to realize that some foods, especially in high quantities, can be damaging to your health. And I think that there's a pretty solid argument that Brazil nuts may fit into this category. For reference, another food that may make it into this category would be high consumption of seaweed. But let me be clear. Eating a few Brazil nuts every now and then here or there is not going to cause a problem. But if your sole purpose for eating Brazil nuts is to increase your selenium intake, then there's a good argument to make that getting your selenium from supplements may be a superior method. This is because the selenium concentration within supplements do not vary anywhere near as much as the selenium content found within Brazil nuts, and because supplements allow you to more finely tune your dose day by day. This means you can more easily experiment with what your body needs by taking higher doses or lower doses. If you're dead set on eating Brazil nuts for your sole intake of selenium, then my recommendation would be to eat no more than 1 Brazil nut every day. This will provide you with some baseline level of selenium, even though that dose will be variable, and it will ensure that you stay as far away as possible from doses that may induce selenium toxicity or even increase your risk of diabetes. In terms of your total selenium intake, my recommendation for healthy adults would be to consume no more than 100 micrograms every day. This number can be higher for certain populations, including patients who have thyroid disease or in patients who have Hashimoto's thyroiditis. In that case, consuming as much as 200 micrograms per day may be beneficial. This is because the benefits of higher doses of selenium on things like thyroid function outweigh any potential risk of higher dose selenium. At the end of the day, remember, this is just information. You'll need to figure out what works best for your body through experimentation. So if you've been eating 1 Brazil nut a day and you're feeling great, then stick with it. But on the other hand, if you've been eating multiple Brazil nuts every day and you're still not feeling well, that may be a sign that you need to change things up. And if you're worried that you may have accidentally taken too much selenium, either from food or from supplements or both, then I'd recommend checking out this video next, which outlines the potential side effects of selenium toxicity.